Some of you are going through really difficult days. Tragedy, heartache, pain. But here's what we're going to learn today, is that our faith grows the most in the darkest, most difficult days. Our faith doesn't normally grow and flourish in the really good days. Faith flourishes in the bad days when we see God's hand in the whole thing. Join us today as we see how this plays out with Joseph. All right, good morning. Welcome to our Genesis series. Glad you are joining us. What I'm going to tell you in the next 1 minute, you can fast forward if you don't want to hear this, is something that if you normally watch our Bible study or if you normally come to Bible study in Phoenix, you're going to need to know this, but you know, in 2024, it's not going to matter. But we are in May of 2023. And so this is actually going to be our last Genesis lesson for the next 13 weeks for our summer break. So I always say, if you are new, welcome, but then goodbye. Okay. But actually that's not true. I'm taking 13 weeks off. My brain needs to go sit by the ocean someplace. And then I say that, but we're actually going to Israel because when we come back, we're going to finish Genesis. We'll be back August 23rd. And we'll be back online again with all new stuff. And then we're going to finish out Genesis, and then we will move into 2 back-to-back series on the Gospel of John and Romans. So we'll do John one day, Romans the next, John that week. That's how this is all going to play out. So we're going to go to Israel, and we're going to videotape about 100 segments for our John series, because we want you to see the land that Jesus walked and that he taught, and you see all this archaeological evidence so you can see that what the Bible says is true is actually really true, because the places are there. So that's going to be the plan for the next 13 weeks. I promise you I'm not slacking, okay? I will be working on vacation, but I thought it was funny. I woke up the other morning and I started crying because I was like, Rob, oh my gosh, like we're getting ready to go do this trip, and it's so hot in Israel, it's ridiculous in the summertime. And I'm like, you know, my brain doesn't work the same as it used to, and it's going to be hot, and then what if you die, and then everyone's going to blame me. So I went through that whole thing, and Rob's like, wow, I think you need a hormone patch. So there's that. So we're taking one bite of the elephant at a time and getting that done. So we will be back August 23rd. During the summer, like I said, if you're in 2024, none of this even matters to you right now. I'm taking the month off of our Monday Psalm series, but we'll be back in July for that. We'll have a new series called Turnaround that will be starting May 31st, and that'll be every Wednesday, so you'll have something in the summertime to watch until we actually come back, and then we'll have our Friday series. So you'll still have videos to watch. It's just not going to be in person. We'll be not in person for 13 weeks. So there is that. All right, let's begin our study in Genesis today. And I want to begin with a video, and I want you to watch this because I want us to keep this in our mind every day of our life. So watch this.
Climbing a mountain is much like life's great trek. Each step a challenge, a test of our will. The journey is long and the path is oftentimes rugged and treacherous. Yet still we press on. The summit is the goal, a distant dream, a shining beacon calling us to rise. With each ascent, we gain a wider view of all of life's challenges and our need for a divine helper. Every step is a triumph over fear. The mountain's peak reminds me my victory is near. So I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not let my foot slip. He who watches over me will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord watches over me. The Lord is my shade at my right hand. The sun will not harm me by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep me from all harm. He will watch over my life. The Lord will watch over my coming and my going, both now and forevermore.
For all the mountains, all the trials, all the hurts, everything that comes into our life, just like what Joseph has been going through, the main thing we need to ask ourselves is, where does our help come from? Like, where do we get our help from? And the answer should be the same as it was with Joseph, and that is this: our help comes from the Lord. So let's continue in Genesis. We'll catch up really quick because we want to talk about Joseph and how his help came from the Lord. Here's a quick recap for those of you that may be just joining us new. Joseph was the favored son of Jacob. I'll put our little dysfunctional family tree on here. Rachel was the love of his life. She had two sons, Joseph and Benjamin, and then she died. But he had a whole bunch of other stepbrothers, 10 of them to be exact. They hated him because they knew that he was their daddy Jacob's favorite. So one day they were all 2-day trip away from their home and they saw Joseph coming up, and the 10 older brothers decided that they wanted to get rid of him. So the original plan was to kill him, but then they decided, nah, he's our brother. Let's just sell him to traders that were on their way to Egypt. And that's exactly what they did. They sold him to some traders. He's bye-bye. They went home, told their daddy that Joseph died, was eaten by some animals. And that was that. And so now we find Joseph in his new normal. He's in Egypt. A man by the name of Potiphar bought him. Joseph worked hard. Everyone loved him. Apparently even Potiphar's wife. If you did not watch last week's lesson, you need to watch it if for no other reason than to see the Skit Guys video on how they represent this. It's the funniest thing in the whole world. But Potiphar's wife decides she thinks Joseph's super hot. She wants to have sex with him, so she tries desperately to get him to sleep with her, and he says no. He runs. She's vindictive. She cries rape. Joseph goes to prison for years. He meets a cupbearer to Pharaoh in prison. The cupbearer has a dream. Joseph interprets the dream correctly. The cupbearer gets restored to his position. Joseph says, please, please, please remember me when you get back out. I don't deserve to be in prison. And we ended up with, and the cupbearer forgot Joseph. And now Joseph is going to continue to be stuck in prison. So today I want to start off and talk about prison. This made me laugh. Someone did this. They said, some of you feel like you are in prison every day when you go to work because your office cell or the office space that you work in feels a lot like prison. So they wrote this. In prison, you spend the majority of your time in an 8x10 cell. At work, you spend most of your time in a 6x8 cubicle. In prison, you get 3 meals a day. At work, you only get a break for 1 meal, but then you have to pay for that one. In prison, you can watch TV and play games. At work, you get fired for watching TV and playing games. In prison, you get your own toilet. At work, you have to share. In prison, they allow your family and friends to visit. At work, you cannot even speak to your family and friends. In prison, you spend most of your life looking through bars. At work, you spend most of your time wanting to get out and go to the bars. I don't know why I thought that was funny. Now, most of us will never go to actual prison like Joseph did. But sometimes the situations that we have in life, we feel like we're actually in prison. For some of you, it could be you feel like you're in a marriage prison, a bad job prison, a wayward child prison, a depression prison, a sickness prison, a shame prison, finance, whatever it is that you're going through. You can look at that like that's your prison cell. And all of those can feel like you're kind of stuck. But here's what I'm hoping we can learn today from Joseph and from his time spent in prison. Because I truly actually do believe this, that prison can grow our faith in Jesus more than comfort can. And like I said, we're not talking a literal prison. Whatever prison, your marriage, whatever it is, you can grow in your faith more during those times than when you're comfortable and everything is great. So what brought me to want to talk about this today is I was reading a book a few weeks ago. It's called The Insanity of God. And it's written by Nick Ripken. And so I'm going to tell you his story, and it really actually will have something to do with Joseph. So just kind of hang in there listening to this. The author, Nick, and his wife, they wanted to be missionaries. They took really serious when Jesus said, go out into the world and share the good news of Jesus to everyone you can meet. So they decided to become missionaries to Somalia. Now, Somalia, they went there in the worst possible time. For the few years that they were there, it was a very, very dark time. There was no food. There was a lot of starvation, a lot of death. I mean, people were dying all around them. It was oppressed with darkness, okay? The whole, Somalia was basically 99 point whatever, Muslim majority. There might have been maybe 30 Christians in the whole country. You were not allowed to talk about Jesus. You were not allowed to share your faith. And so Nick and his wife were there to really help people like get food. I mean, that was their job there, in hopes that maybe he could share the gospel, at some point meeting with people. So in the process of this, Nick comes in contact with 4 believers. And so they meet secretly in a warehouse and they do communion together and they share their stories. But a couple weeks later, he finds out that those 4 Christians have been murdered because of their faith in Jesus. And Nick is completely devastated. Now, right on the heels of this, his 16-year-old son dies over there. And he is just a mess. Everything in his life looks hopeless. And some of you get that because that's how you feel today. You feel like everything in your life just feels like hopelessness. But I'm hoping that we can learn something from Nick this morning that will change your viewpoint, your perspective on the hopeless prison that you feel that you're in. So Nick and his wife leave. They come back to the United States to kind of regroup. His faith felt pretty shattered at this point because he was trying to come to grips and he didn't know the answer to this. How do you share the good news of Jesus in a country like Somalia? How do you do that amidst evil and darkness? And all it looks like is that Satan's winning. And if you are a Christian and you go there, like you're trying to bring the light, but then it costs you your life. So how do you do that? How do you be a Christian, live a Christian, follow Jesus in a place like Somalia? So when he came back, he realized he needed to know how other Christians did it. How did they make it through to where he was struggling? How do people live in a country where you can't share your faith, you can't talk about Jesus, and yet all over the world there are people that do it? And so he wanted to talk to those people who are highly, highly persecuted for their faith. And he wanted to know what their secret was. So he decides to go to find Christians in other countries where the gospel is forbidden. And he needs to see how they do it, how they can be a light for Jesus in dark places. So here's what he learned, which will tie into Joseph. We learn this, that faith grows most in the darkest, most difficult times in our life. And the Christians that Nick spoke to in all of these countries, most of these people's faith grew in, like Joseph, actual prisons. Because of their faith in Jesus, they were sent away to literal prisons, just like Joseph. They were out of their comfort zone. They were without their family and friends. But here is what they all said. When they only had Jesus, they learned he was enough. And I think there's a really good lesson in there for us. When those of us, let's say to those of you that struggle in your marriage or your finances, when all you have is Jesus, that's where you're going to turn. That's where you're going to focus on. That's who you're going to cling to. That's who you're going to pray to. That's where you're going to get your comfort and your peace and your joy. All of that comes from him, no matter what your circumstances. So Nick flies to Russia, where he's able to speak to a group of, persecuted Christians. And most of them, like I said, had been in prison for their faith. So Nick talked to a Russian pastor who had been in prison for 15 years. And Nick said this. He said, I am so sorry that that happened to you. And this pastor looked at him like, what? Why are you sorry that that happened to us? And that was the same thing every time Nick said that to other Christians. I'm so sorry that happened to you. The Russian pastor said this. This is what we signed up for. This is what following Jesus is about. This is the norm for followers of Jesus all around the world. See, persecution in our country is like the sun coming up every day. That's what he said. We don't get that. Persecution in the United States is nothing. We don't have persecution. Like, we don't get that here. But for them, it's like you wake up, the sun comes up, and there's persecution. That's just the way it is. And they're okay with it because they understand that that's what following Jesus is all about. Now, we don't get that. If we put like a Bible verse on our Facebook page and then someone unfriends us, we're just like, oh my gosh, I'm being persecuted. I get that. When we don't get invited to that party because people like, I don't want to invite that Christian, you know, then we feel like we're being persecuted. And in a sense we are, but nothing like followers of Jesus around the world where following Jesus is illegal, okay? And it could really cost you your life. But for people in these other countries, they understand what it means to surrender their life to Jesus. And my fear in America is that we have it so easy. We go to air-conditioned churches and air-conditioned Bible studies, and honestly, I'm all for that, okay? We went to Africa once and we're in a 2-hour church service where there was no air conditioning and it was so hot. And yet I looked around and I saw all these people worshiping and crying, just totally in love with Jesus, and I'm like, it's so hot in here, okay? So I get that, but because there is no hardship or persecution, what I'm realizing is that faith doesn't grow in the United States like it does in other countries. It just doesn't. So Nick goes to the Ukraine, same story. Nick goes to China, same story. But in China, he learned something interesting. He meets with some house church leaders, where in China you're not allowed to do that, but everything is hush-hush. You know, you become a Christian, you find a house church. It's very like, okay, you know, be there at 9 in the morning, but you know, some show up at 9, some show at 9:30, some at 10, because you can't let anyone know what you're doing. Like, you pretend you're watching a soccer game or something like that. But they're constantly on edge, watching out for the police. When Rob and I went to China, we actually went to one of these house churches, and it was like that. Like, it was hush-hush. People would come in at different times. You know, you don't want other people to know and draw attention to the fact that everyone is Sunday morning going to this one apartment, because they'll get shut down. The pastor will go to prison. That's just the way it is. So anyway, all that to say, Nick was with a bunch of Christian pastors, and this is what he said. He said it seemed that most of the house church leaders in the room had served at least one 3-year prison term for their faith. Surprisingly, none of the people who reported on their time in prison seemed particularly resentful about the experience. At the same time, the believers who had not yet been to prison did not seem to be especially fearful about the possibility of someday having to go themselves. It was clear that these Chinese believers were not seeking persecution. However, their attitude about the likelihood of persecution seemed to be an attitude of common acceptance. That's just the norm for following Christ. The attitude was not so much if it comes, the more common attitude was when it comes. Virtually every believer who I had met in China had either been to prison for the faith or they knew someone who had. They were personally aware of many of their spiritual brothers and sisters who had endured persecution and had come out of it with, and this is my point, this is what they came out of it with. Here you go. Deeper spiritual roots, a more mature faith, and a greater appreciation for fellowship with other believers. They also came out of the experience with a much stronger relationship with the Lord. And I love that. That's what I think hardship does if you let it. But what Nick learned goes back to the story of Joseph. The prison time, the waiting time. These believers in China or Russia or the Ukraine, in the waiting time, in the prison, you know, I'm just waiting TikTok for God to do something, they didn't fall apart. They didn't. They did what Joseph did. And that was this: they live for God regardless of the circumstances. And that's what we're supposed to do as followers of Jesus. We don't have that kind of persecution, but whatever our trials are, we need to live for Jesus regardless of the circumstances. Here is where I want to go with this. One of the house church leaders in China said this: Do you know what prison is for us? It is how we get our theological education. In other words, he says this prison in China is for us like seminary is for training church leaders in your country. In other words, that's what happens. Like, they go to prison and they learn everything they need to know about God. They know Jesus better. They have time. Like, they get all of their theological education in prison. Because think about it, the prisons are filled with Christians. And so now they get together and they can talk about the Lord, and it's kind of a cool deal. But it was such an insight because it reminded me that that's how we should look at any trial in our life. Any prison that we feel like we're in, as a way to get our theological education, to know Jesus more. Because here's what they learned, and what we learn when we go through trials is this, is that when they only had Jesus, they learned he was enough. Now for us in America, we don't have to worry too much about, underground churches and being thrown into prison for our faith. This made me laugh. Speaking of prison, there was an old farmer, and his son had gone to prison. So the old farmer, wrote to his son and said, "This year I won't be able to plant potatoes because I can't dig the field." He said, "I'm getting too old and it's too hard for me to dig the ground, so I'm not going to be able to plant this year." He told his son, he said, "I know if you were here, you would help me." The son wrote back and said, "Dad, don't even think about digging the potato field up because that's where I buried the money I stole." Police intercepted this letter and read it, and the very next day, the entire team of officers dug up the whole potato field looking for the money, and then realized that nothing was found. The next day, the son wrote to the dad and said, "Okay, Dad, now the field's dug up. Now you can go plant the potatoes. That's the best I can do while I'm in prison." I love that. It's like, great, you have the police officers dig the field for you. But my question is this. Why are these Christians in Russia, Ukraine, and China flourishing in their faith? How is it that they leave prisons after being tortured and beaten, and they love Jesus more at the other end of that than at the beginning? And that fascinates me. And I think it's because they really spend their time getting to know God in the darkest times, which is what I'm saying for us. In our darkest times, those are the times that we should be pressing in to get to know Jesus even better. Now let's move that into Joseph's life. How is it that Joseph is still in prison? God doesn't seem to be rescuing him. Some of you feel that same way. Joseph doesn't know how long he's going to be there. Am I going to be here forever? He doesn't know. You don't know how long your trial is going to last. For Joseph, he's been forgotten by the cupbearer. Some of you feel like you've been forgotten by God. And yet, Joseph's relationship is stronger than ever going through all of this. And I think the same should be true for us. Now, our difficulty, like I said, may not be an actual prison. It might be the divorce or the heartache or the loss of a loved one, or it might be watching someone destroy their life, or any kind of a trial. But I think we would be wise to learn from the pastors in China when they say, "Do you know what prison did for us? It is how we get our theological education." That's like us saying this. Do you know what this trial, this hurt, this loss, this heartache, this pain, this sickness, this suffering is for us? It's how we get our theological education. It's how we really honestly get to know God. And when I read that, I thought about Joseph. He was in prison. He persevered. He dug in. He trusted that God knew what he was doing. He didn't know how long he was going to be there. He didn't know if he would ever see his family again. He didn't know if his dad was alive. He didn't even know if his baby brother Benjamin was alive. Or did his brothers sell him to traders also? He didn't know. But regardless, he never quit. He allowed God to use this as his seminary to grow up his faith. And we should do the same. Even when we think that the trial's almost over, but then it's not. Even when we think this cannot possibly get any worse, but it does. Even when we pray for a miracle and God is completely silent. This is a lesson that we need to learn from Joseph. And it's this: we need to seek God more in our prison. We need to search the scriptures more in our prison. We need to cling to God more in our prison, even when the timing is so incredibly frustrating. I think we need to look at our trials with a different perspective, knowing this. That prison can grow our faith in Jesus more than comfort can. So we ended last week, the cupbearer and the baker who were in prison with Joseph, they both had dreams. Joseph interpreted their dreams. The cupbearer would live, the baker would die. And those dreams were interpreted correctly, and that is exactly what happened. So when the cupbearer gets out, he became, back in the good graces of the Pharaoh. And Joseph said, please, please, please remember me. And Joseph probably thinks, my trial is almost over. I'm about ready to get out of prison. You can imagine him sitting on his bed, like, bags packed, just waiting for them to come and, turn the key and let him out. But one day turned into 2, and 2 turned into a month, and a month turned into a year. And now, we pick it up in Genesis 41:1. Now it happened the end of 2 full years. 2 more years in prison. When Joseph thought, I'm going to be out of here soon, he wasn't. It was 2 more years. And Joseph had learned this, that he could not change his situation. Only God could. Only God could. You're like, 2 more years? How is it the cupbearer forgot Joseph for 2 more years? But here's the exciting news for us all. God made sure that the cupbearer forgot Joseph. God did that. Okay, Joseph doesn't understand why, just like you don't understand your trials, but God does things that you're just like, what? It makes no sense to you. But never forget, he's working. Never forget this. That is how up close and personal God is to our circumstances. Some people think that God is way up there in heaven and he doesn't really care about me. That's not true. Okay, please know that. When you start looking back at your life, you go, wow, God made sure you didn't get that job that he knew was bad for you. God made sure that guy didn't call you back that he knew was bad for you. God made sure you forgot to make that call. God made sure you missed that appointment. God made sure the traffic was so bad that you missed your flight. See, God made sure because he is that big and he is really in control. And when when God becomes that big to you, life becomes simple and peaceful. Because you're like, I don't know why this bad thing just happened, but I know God's in control. I'm trusting him. You don't have to be filled with anxiety or depression. You don't have to do any of those things. Because now you know God so well that you know what he's doing something. And we learn all of this from Joseph. Our lives will really change when we see God in everything. And we learn this by how God worked with Joseph. Genesis 41:1. Now it happened at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream. And behold, he was standing at the Nile. And lo, from the Nile there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed in the marsh grass. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after from the Nile, ugly and gaunt, and they stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. The ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 sleek and fat cows. Then Pharaoh awoke. He fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain came up on a single stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 ears, thin and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up after them. The thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump and full ears. Then Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Now, when I have bad dreams or weird dreams, they usually fade during the day. Most of the time I'm like, what did that mean? And then it's forgotten. But this dream was so impactful that Pharaoh just could not get over it. Verse 8, now in the morning, his spirit, which was Pharaoh, was troubled. So he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was no one who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Just like God could give Joseph the interpretation, he also could give magicians a blank mind. And if this were a play, this is when we would say this. Enter, cupbearer, because now is the right time. Now is the right time. And God brought Joseph to the cupbearer's mind 2 years later because the timing is right. Genesis 41 verse 9, then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, today I am reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was hanged. Now, that's a pretty convincing story. Hey, Pharaoh, I just remembered something. Remember when you were kind of mad at me and you put me in prison for a little while? Okay, yeah. Well, that might have been a really good thing on your part, because guess what? I met a Hebrew. I met this guy in prison. I had this dream. The baker had a dream. The Hebrew guy interpreted our dreams exactly. Maybe he can help you. Pharaoh, you had this dream. Call on him. I bet he would know the answer. And so he's probably like, oops, sorry, Joe. Just remembered I was supposed to tell Pharaoh about you like 2 years ago. So God does something amazing, but he does it in his time, in his way, where he is the only one who gets the credit. Verse 14, so Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. And it took a lot of years to get Joseph to this point, a lot of years. And what we're going to see is this. God used his past experiences, think of your past experiences, his past hurts, his past heartaches, his past injustices, his past relationships, his past of, his gift of interpreting dreams. And God brought it all together at the right time for God to finally use him the way he needs to. And so when you're in your waiting period and nothing's happening, please relax. Remember this story knowing that the puzzle pieces aren't put together yet. So finally, 2 years later, the cupbearer remembered him. Isn't that like God? Like really, it just is. We assume we're going to get that certain job. We're so excited, but you know what? We didn't get it. We were turned down for the job, but then something better comes along a year later and you go, wow, thank you, God. It's like we think this relationship's going to last a lifetime, but then the person breaks up with you and you're just like, what? But then a year later you meet someone and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad that guy dumped me. Like that's just how God works. We spend so much time waiting and wondering and questioning, and we're always so confused, but then God shows up in this most unlikely way. And for Joseph, the most unlikely, unimaginable scene was knock, 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 open the door. Joseph, come on, Pharaoh wants to meet you. You're like, what? The greatest man in Egypt wants to talk to me? You're like, what? And here's the deal. This moment is brought to you by what? A lot of bad things that happened to Joseph. Some of you are like, why did all these bad things happen? Why did all these bad things happen to Joseph? God was doing something. He was getting him to the point where he needed him. So this moment, this meeting between Pharaoh and Joseph was brought on by a lot of bad things, not good things, but bad things. Joseph didn't get this meeting because he had the best job and the big bank account and the new Mercedes Camel, okay? He didn't get this meeting with Pharaoh because of that. This meeting with the most powerful man in Egypt was brought on by heartache. His jealous brothers, his hateful brothers who sold him, and lied to their dad. His married boss's wife who falsely accused him of rape. The years in prison. The cupbearer who completely forgot he existed. And God is so big that when the timing is right, he pulls it all together. And that's what I want you to see for your own life. But you and I have a choice, just like Joseph had a choice. We can run from God when things get difficult. We can walk away from our faith because God didn't come through the way we thought he should have. We could have become angry with God, assuming, God just doesn't care about me. We can stop going to church. We can stop reading our Bibles, stop coming to Bible study, thinking this God thing just doesn't really work. Or we could do what Joseph did. We can wait on God, knowing his timing is perfect. We can continue to walk in faith regardless of our seemingly unanswered prayers. We can trust that God knows what he's doing, even if we don't see it. And we can look at every circumstance that happens in our life as God ordained, moving us to a new place. And for Joseph, suddenly, out of the blue, he's called with a meeting with Pharaoh. This meeting takes place with a new pair of clothes, a cleanly shaved face, and a one-on-one encounter with, like they said, the most important man in Egypt. Verse 15, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, but no one can interpret it. And I've heard it said about you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. But Joseph then answered Pharaoh and said, it is not me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Isn't that amazing? This is why I love Joseph. For all the troubles in Joseph's life, he never turned his back on God. He never took credit like, yeah, I'm kind of awesome. I will interpret this. No way. He's like, I can't interpret it, but God can. You need to turn to God. That's what you need to do, Pharaoh. And now, standing in front of the most powerful man in Egypt, Joseph gave God all the credit and all the honor that was due him. Joseph knew God alone would give him the capability to interpret Pharaoh's dream. Here's the cool part is that when it came time to promote Joseph, he was ready. He was ready. And we need to recognize this, that most of our lives are in a holding pattern. It just is. But that means that most of these days are just God working behind the scenes. He's taking your life experiences, the people, the friends, the exes, the jobs, the bosses, whoever. And what happens is God will use all these circumstances and people to get you to the moment when He is ready to use you. So until that happens, we said this last week, enjoy where you are, bloom where you're planted, be the best follower of Jesus where you are. Because in God's economy, timing is everything. Better yet, His timing is everything. Genesis 41:17. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream, I was standing on the bank of the Nile. When out of the river, there came up 7 cows, fat and sleek, and they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows came up, scrawny and very ugly and lean. I had never seen such ugly cows in all the land of Egypt. The lean, ugly cows ate up the 7 fat cows that came up first. But even after they ate them, no one could tell that they had done so. They just looked as ugly as before. Then I woke up. In my dream, I also saw 7 heads of grain, full and good, growing on a single stalk. And then 7 other heads sprouted, withered and thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 good heads. I told this to the magicians, but no one could explain it to me. And I love that God immediately gave Joseph the interpretation of this dream. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God, not me, God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up after are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh, God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. In other words, Pharaoh, God gave you 2 different dreams to tell you this absolutely will happen. And Pharaoh, you better take this serious, or you are going to have a huge problem on your hand. And I started laughing because I'm like, here Joseph is getting ready to tell Pharaoh, the most important man of Egypt, what he needs to do. Okay? Verse 33, and now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man, put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. And verse 37, the plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So this is Pharaoh's response, verse 38. So Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, There is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took a signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and men shouted before him, "Make way!" Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, but without your word no one will lift hand or foot in all of Egypt." And then verse 45, Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphnath-Paneah and gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, to be his wife. And Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. I want you to think about this. In one day, Joseph's life changed forever. In one day. In one day, he went from a filthy, dirty, long, matted hair prisoner, someone overseeing other prisoners, living in a dungeon, prison clothes, lonely, unshaven, in one day, to Pharaoh's right-hand man. Suddenly he has a signet ring, new clothes, jewelry, chariot, a new wife. He went from a season of suffering to a season of plenty. And I want you to always remember that. Because Joseph is where he is. His season of plenty, second in command of Pharaoh, most powerful man in Egypt, because of all the bad things that happened in his life. Because his 10 brothers hurt him deeply over 14 years before. Joseph could have been bitter for those 14 years. He could have been hateful. He could have sat around feeling sorry for himself. But instead, he added God into his equation, and his life was better for it. And yours can be too, if you let God do that. Verse 46, Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentiful. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city, he had put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. The first 7 years, Joseph is working diligently to store as much food as possible in preparation for this famine. But think what he could have done. Think about when Pharaoh hands him the ring and says, "You're second in command." Joseph could have said this, "Hey, Pharaoh, you know what? Can I just run back home to Israel? I need to take care of some family business back there, okay?" But he never did that because he added God into the situation and realized that what his brothers did 14-ish years ago, this was all part of God's plan for his life. To bring him to this moment, to save the nation of Egypt, or the country of Egypt, and also to save Israel at that particular time. So when you recognize that God is a part of your divorce or the death or the whatever it is, the financial ruin, when you can realize God's a part of it, you don't need to go take care of anything. God will take care of things for you. And maybe that's going to help you. I hope so. Because if someone stole from you or lied from you or hurt you or didn't meet your expectations or whatever, you can just change your perspective and say, you know what, God is really in this. I don't need to worry about that person. Because Joseph understood that God allowed his brothers to do what they did to get Joseph to this point in Egypt. Never forget this in Psalm 139:16. David said, "Your eyes have seen my unformed substance, and in your book were written all the days that were ordained for me, when as yet there was not one of them." If we take that really, really seriously, you can realize that every single day, if you're a follower of Jesus, has been ordained for you to do what God needs you to do on this earth. You don't have to worry about that. He says it, in all my days were written in your book. Every one of them, before I was even born. I mean, that's the coolest thought ever. So that person that hurt you, whatever. Okay? That loss, whatever. God, I don't know. God's ordained this for me. I don't know why. If we take it seriously, I think we can actually forget the past and we can forgive people who hurt us. Knowing that God's ordained it all. We don't have to worry about it. But just like Joseph, the hurt and the pain were allowed by God, which tells me this: God can use something meant for evil and turn it to good. The painful divorce, God can use for good. The loss of your job because someone falsely accused you, God can use that for good. I get that you feel devastated to begin with, but knowing that God is in it should change how we respond and how we react. Verse 50, before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, "It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." Here's the lesson that some of you need to hear today. You need to forget, okay? You need to forget the past. You need to forget the hurt, the abandonment, the abuse, the ex, the boss who fired you, the friend who turned your back, the child who disappointed you. It's time to forget all of that. Because we learned this from Joseph. He could not move forward to do the work of God that God would call him to do if he held on to the past. If Joseph hung on to the past and was bitter and angry and poor me, I've lost everything, God can't use him. And it's interesting that Joseph named his firstborn son Forget, because Joseph had a lot of things that he needed to forget. He would have to forget that he would never see his mom again. He would have to forget that his brothers who hated him sold him. He would have to forget his separation from his father. He would have to forget his fear. What will happen to me? His doubt. Where is God in all of this? If he got stuck in any of those places, he would have wallowed in self-pity instead of embracing that God brought him to a new place. But in order to do that, we have to throw off the weight of everything that the past that's holding us down. We have to get rid of the past. Hebrews 12:1 says this, "Therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders." Throw off anything that hinders us from growing up and running with perseverance the race marked out for us. Then Joseph has a second son. Verse 52, the second son he named Ephraim and said, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." Here's what we know about Joseph. Joseph acknowledges that he has suffered. Okay, some of you could acknowledge, I was abused, I was, hurt, I was, whatever. But out of the suffering came an abundance of good. You need to make sure you add that into your story too. The abundance of good meant for him, he had new life, new responsibilities, a new wife, children that brought him joy. He had the favor of Pharaoh, and he had success. And he had all of this because of his past, his hurtful past. Today you might need to remember Philippians 3:13. "Brothers, I do not consider myself yet to have taken hold of it, but one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and straining towards what is ahead." Look forward, not backward. A lesson from Charlie Brown and Lucy. During a baseball game, Lucy explains to Charlie Brown at the end of the game why she had lost sight of that ball that was coming down to her. She failed to make the catch. She said, "Sorry, I missed that easy see if I can talk. She said, "Sorry, I missed that easy fly ball." She goes, "I thought I had it, but suddenly I remembered all the other balls that I had missed, and the past got in my eyes." Don't let the past get in your eyes. And because Joseph didn't, and we see that, he spent 7 years reserving up food for the famine that was about ready to hit. God could use him at this mighty time for such a time as this. Verse 53, the 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. Then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph and do what he tells you." When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all the countries came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe in all the world. And because of the famine, Joseph is about ready to come face to face with the men who destroyed his life 20 years before. Here's what we need to remember, especially if you've been deeply hurt by someone. The Bible says this: people will reap what they sow. That's a promise from God. Galatians 6:7 says this: do not be deceived, God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, this he will also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption, but the one who sows from the Spirit to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. Let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due time we will reap if we do not grow weary. Joseph did not grow weary, and in due time, God would take care of the people, his brothers, that hurt him so badly. This joke made me laugh. This is a man who didn't grow weary. With this joke, you're going to be like, wow, now I know why Lisa needs to go on vacation. She needs to come up with some new jokes. One day this man goes to an auction. While he's there, he bids on a parrot, okay? And he really, really wants this bird. So he gets caught up in the bidding, and he'd bid and he'd get outbid, and then he'd bid again and get outbid. And he's like, who is that keeps doing that? Finally, after the bid was way more than he intended, he won the bid. The parrot was his at last. So he was paying for the parrot, and he said to the auctioneer, man, I sure hope that parrot can talk. He said, I'd hate to have paid so much for this and then find out that he doesn't speak. And the auctioneer said, yeah, don't worry, he can talk. Who do you think kept bidding against you? Okay, yes, go on vacation, Lisa. All right, Joseph sowed honesty, and he sowed integrity into his life. And now he's reaping all the benefits of that. His brothers, on the other hand, 20 years ago, remember, now it's been about, what, how many years now? Oh, yeah, 20 years ago. 7 years, so yeah, 20 years. His brothers have reaped the consequences of what they did to Joseph all those years before. And we see this as the scene shifts from Egypt to Canaan, where Joseph's dad, Jacob, is still alive, and his 10 brothers that got rid of him, and his baby brother Benjamin. So there's 11 boys and Jacob, and then all those people's kids. Here is a map right here. You can see the green line is where Joseph was taken all the way up in Dothan, taken all the way down into Egypt. The red line shows where Jacob and the 11 sons were living, right there in Beersheba. And they would have to walk all the way to, right there, you see Goshen. And they would have to walk there to get grain. So I wonder if back in Egypt, I mean, Joseph's seeing all these people coming from all these different towns and coming from Israel wanting to get food. And I wonder if he thought, I wonder if my brothers will show up. I wonder if they're starving. I wonder what's going on with them. And because he has no idea. He has no idea what's going on. No Facebook, no cell phones, no nothing, all right? Genesis 42:1. Now Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt. So Joseph's dad, Jacob, is like, okay, we hear there's grain in Egypt. And Jacob said to his sons, why are you staring at one another? He said, behold, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us from that place so that we may live and not die. Then 10 brothers of Joseph went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he said, I'm afraid that harm may befall him. And I say this, for the love. I don't know what it's going to take for Jacob, apparently, he can't do this. I mean, his favoritism for Joseph over the 10 brothers is what got Joseph in the place he's at. And now they're doing this, he's doing the same thing with Benjamin. Like, it's like, here's our little family tree here. You know, you've got Rachel over there who had Joseph and Benjamin. Joseph's, of course, in Egypt. Benjamin's the favorite. All those other brothers, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, all of those guys, you know, and you're going, didn't you just do that, Jacob? It causes hardship. You can't have favoritism with all your kids. But now you're seeing that he kind of replaced Joseph with Benjamin, and he's terrified. He does not want to lose Benjamin. And so he's so afraid that he's going to die like Joseph. And he's not too worried the other 10 are going to die, but he is worried about baby Benjamin, okay? But you wonder, after Joseph's brothers sold him to traders 20 years earlier, you wonder how the 10 boys felt about Benjamin. Because remember, they hated Joseph because he was daddy's favorite. Do they hate Benjamin too? Like, do they want to get rid of him too? Because apparently getting rid of Joseph didn't make the daddy loves them more than us any better. Because Benjamin's still there. Verse 5. So the sons of Israel came to buy grain among those who were coming, for the famine was in the land of Canaan also. Now Joseph was the ruler over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land, and Joseph's brothers came, and look what you see here, and bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. I want you to imagine the scene. Joseph is there in charge of all the food in Egypt, and he's busy making sure that like everyone gets their allotment. And suddenly he looks up to see 10 foreign guys from Israel bowing down. And I wonder what he felt like when he saw them. He probably thought they look a little familiar, but it's been 20 years. I look at pictures 20 years ago of me and I'm like, wow, those peanut M&Ms have done their number on me, okay? But people change, they become even unrecognizable. I was laughing because Dusty, our youngest 25, he called one day and because he's in college and he's like, Mom, I have to take this class, but they need my immunization records. And I'm like, who keeps immunization records for like 25 years of your kids? And then I probably thought, well, every mother but me, I guess, does that. But B, is his pediatrician even alive? Like, it's been 25 years, okay? Is he even practicing? Like, I don't even know where to begin. So I looked him up and I saw his picture and I'm like, oh, for the love, I would never have recognized him in a million years. Because 20 years does a lot. It adds pounds, it adds wrinkles, it adds hair or no hair, whatever that looks like for you. So I bet not only did Joseph's brothers look different, I bet they looked older. I bet they looked really worn out. Because here's what we know. Sin does that to people. Unrepentant sin does that to people. It's like this weight that you carry around with you. But here they are. In Egypt, probably terrified. They don't want to be here. They know they sold their brother. You know, they're like, I hope we don't run into him. That would be super awkward. But they're bowing down before this man. They have no idea that this man is their brother. Verse 7, as soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. Where do you come from? He asked. From the land of Canaan, they replied, to buy food. Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Joseph never made himself known at this point to his brothers. For all they knew, the man speaking to them was an Egyptian. Joseph would have been dressed like an Egyptian. He would have spoken like an Egyptian. You know, he would have spoken in their language. And these 10 boys, they knew like, okay, only someone really close, high up, you know, to Pharaoh would be in charge of the grain. It never occurred to them in a million years that this was their brother that they sold to traders 20 years before. And yet this is the moment that I think it might have all finally come together for Joseph. Because remember, what threw this whole situation with their brothers was 20 years ago when Joseph had the dream. And he thought it was funny. And he told his brothers, like, I had this dream that you all bowed down to me. And they're like, what? We would never bow down to you. And yet here they are, bowing down to this supposed dreamer that threw them into this whole crazy madness that they did. 20 years ago, they made a mockery of what Joseph said. We're not going to bow down to you. Who do you think you are, little boy? They laughed at him. And here Joseph is recognizing the dream that he had when he was a teenager. And he realized that this dream that God had given him was finally coming to fruition because his brothers were literally bowing down to him. I cannot even imagine what he was thinking. So you are going to love this. You know when you, it comes like May and you have your favorite TV shows and all of a sudden it's the season finale, all right? And then you're like, okay, what? I have to wait for 3 months before we get the answer? And that is exactly what we're going to do here. And I'm so sorry to tell you that. But this is the cliffhanger that we're leaving you with until August 23rd, 2023, all right? And then we will be back and we will pick this story up and see what exactly happens. But our takeaway today is this. I want to remind you about the first story with the Christians in prison, the followers of Jesus in China, Ukraine, all these places. And I want you to remember what they said. Do you know what prison is for us? It's how we get our theological education. Look where Joseph is now, second in command of Pharaoh. Look where Joseph was, in prison. Let God use whatever prison you are in. The marriage prison, job prison, bitterness prison, vengeance prison, whatever prison you are in, and let God use that prison as theological training. Let the Holy Spirit use the things that are in there to say, God, change me. I don't want to be that way. I want to be a true follower of you that listens to you, that reacts to things differently than what most people do. Let God use your prison time to teach you things about yourself and what you need to know about Jesus. Here's what I say, don't let your hurt go to waste. Joseph didn't. He didn't let his hurt go to waste. And never forget that timing is everything. Better yet, his timing is everything. Wait, trust, God knows exactly what he's doing. And don't give up, because no matter how difficult your situation is, you need to remember this story of Joseph, that God was in it all the time. Have a good summer. See you August 23rd.